The dreadnought, symbol of Britain's traditional supremacy at sea. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, that supremacy was already being challenged. Naval rivalry between Britain and Germany had its origins in the colonial and economic frictions of the late 19th century. But by the first decade of this century, the issue was a different one. Now it was a matter of prestige and national security. Britain, dependent for its survival on seaborne trade, could never allow the German naval challenge to go unanswered. Nor could France tolerate the addition of a powerful navy to Germany's existing military superiority on land. In 1907, the British Empire threw in its lot with France and Russia. Germany allied itself with Austria. Between 1912 and 1914, the two alliances transformed themselves into armed camps. Already it was clear that if war did come, it would be on an unprecedented scale. Germany could muster an army, including reserves, of over 5 million men. Stiffened by the high technical standards of officers and NCOs, the result was the largest and most highly trained army in Europe. An army that France, the ancient enemy, could hardly hope to match. France had only 60% of Germany's manpower, and by drafting every able-bodied male, could raise an army of only 4 million men. But in practice, the situation was even worse. The French General Staff counted only on professional troops for frontline service, a mere 1 million men. But this war would be a war of more than just flesh and blood. For the first time in history, great industrial powers would make war on each other. In the war to come, the battlefields would be dominated not by the courage of men, but by the destructive power of guns. The German war plan was to hold the Russians at bay while attacking France in a huge wheel through Belgium. The Schlieffen plan had been finalized as early as 1905. It depended utterly on the rapid advance of huge numbers of men and guns. Between 1870 and 1914, the number of German railway lines running to the western border had been increased from 9 to 13. As the Great War approached, they were used to the full. The German mobilization by rail was a masterpiece of organization. August 4th, 1914, the first day of the Great War. The mass movements of the Schlieffen plan were in full swing. 550 trains a day were crossing the Rhine bridges. But as mobilization turned to invasion, the German military machine was already showing fatal weaknesses. Communications, vital for the control of such a vast army, were grossly inadequate. Much was wantonly destroyed. German cavalry leading the advance wrecked Belgian telephone lines and instruments. Even railway lines, vital for the transport of troops, were destroyed by artillery. Disjointed though the movements of the German armies had become, they still advanced at great speed. But that speed was itself to sow the seeds of failure. The advance was fast outrunning its supplies. Many regiments, in order to march quickly, had left their field kitchens behind. Thousands of troops were without bread for 4 days. By the time the infantry reached the River Marne, they were fatigued, dispirited, and hungry. The opening battles of the Great War had seemed to confirm French predictions. The High Command had planned for a war of maneuver, a war in which highly mobile field artillery would reign supreme. The key to a swift victory seemed already in French hands, the 75mm field gun. In those first few weeks, the finest of quick-firing guns seemed to be everywhere, obliterating German infantry columns with storms of shrapnel. Already by the outbreak of war, the technology of artillery had undergone a revolution. Wire-wound gun barrels had been replaced by barrels of pre-stressed steel. A new type of explosive had increased the distance a shell could be fired. The introduction of the cartridge had made loading a far simpler and faster process. But most important of all, the problem of recoil had finally been solved. The key to recoil control was to separate the barrel of the gun from its carriage, so that when the gun was fired, only the barrel moved. In the French 75, recoil was absorbed by a hydraulic brake, and the barrel was returned to its firing position by compressed air. Now, instead of manhandling the gun after each firing, gunners, protected by a steel shield, could remain in position. The result was a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute, higher than anything achieved before. But the war of the mobile field gun was short-lived. After a major defeat was inflicted on the Germans at the Marne in September 1914, the time was ripe for a speedy Allied counter-offensive. But when it came, it was slow, indecisive, and ultimately a failure. Millions would suffer the consequences. By failing to turn the German retreat into a rout, the Allies allowed new factors to enter the equation: barbed wire and the withering fire of the machine gun. By the end of 1914, the war in the West was in deadlock. By 1908, British observers had already reported the German army's possession of large numbers of machine guns. But the British military establishment had refused to take the new weapon seriously. General Haig himself described it as a much overrated weapon. For British infantrymen facing the combined defensive power of trenches and machine guns, it appeared anything but overrated. Neither had the British much faith in artillery. Haig had made his position quite clear. Artillery seems only likely to be really effective against raw troops, and cavalry will have a larger sphere of action. But it was the devastating effect of artillery on the landscape that was already depriving cavalry of the mobility and speed that had always been their greatest asset. Before the war's end, thousands of cavalry horses, instead of charging into battle, would be pulling gun carriages. Of the Western powers, Germany was the quickest to adapt to the new conditions. German military planners realized that the new warfare would demand new artillery. Guns would give way to howitzers. While guns fire their shells in flat trajectories, the howitzer is an indirect fire weapon, throwing its shell in a high arc. It was perfect for dropping shells over earthworks and into the depths of trenches. But of all the great powers, only Germany had produced howitzers in large numbers. The destructiveness of the German 5.9-inch was to come as a deadly surprise. Faced with trenches and dugouts, changes occurred not only in artillery, but in shells too. In 1914, the emphasis was on killing men in the open. 70% of all shells were shrapnel. Quick-firing field guns with shrapnel shells could deliver more bullets in a given area than machine guns, and at a much longer range. But they were of little use against men in trenches. By 1918, only 30% of shells were shrapnel. 70% were high explosive. By 1915, the expanses of no man's land were a death trap. The only hope for a successful attack was to destroy the enemy's artillery and machine guns in a massive pre-offensive barrage. The problem for the gunners was accuracy. They were expected to destroy targets often far behind the enemy front lines and out of direct sight. They already had new indirect fire gun sights, but above all, they depended on well-positioned observers and accurate maps. Observation balloons linked to headquarters by telephone allowed observers to report the positions of targets and correct the aim of the batteries. But balloons were terribly vulnerable. It took the miniaturization of the wireless set to provide the perfect observer's platform. 1915. The Neuve-Chapelle sector of the Western Front. British spotter aircraft, using the new Pickard folding camera, systematically photographed German lines. Painstakingly, a mosaic of pictures was constructed, covering a strip of front 2,000 yards wide and 1,500 yards deep. This extraordinarily detailed reconnaissance was the prelude to an experiment. March 10th, and the guns of Haig's First Army unleash their opening barrage on German forward positions. But instead of lasting several days, as bombardments invariably did, the first barrage lasted only 35 minutes. Then, suddenly, the guns lengthened their range. As British infantry overran the front-line trenches, a curtain of fire cut off German reinforcements. Neuve-Chapelle was a superb experiment in the coordination of infantry and artillery. But its second phase was a disaster. When the front under attack was extended, artillery support failed to cover the wider area. The reason was a shortage of ammunition, a chronic problem which would soon plague both sides. The new warfare was consuming material resources on an unprecedented scale. Already, the First World War was a war of materials. As the conflict dragged on, the appetite of the guns forced changes that before the war would have seemed inconceivable. The social consequences of the first truly industrial war would reverberate throughout the following decades. On the battlefields, the search was for the elusive key to the trench deadlock. The new tactics of coordinated attacks by artillery and infantry had almost succeeded for the British. Germany took a different route. The intention was that gas, while wreaking destruction on the enemy, would leave the terrain fit for crossing by the attacking force. At Ypres, on April the 22nd, 1915, the new weapon was used to devastating effect. A full-scale gas attack on French lines created a gap 4 miles wide, without a living defender. The first that many knew of the creeping death that approached was the sudden realization that the birds were no longer singing. At Ypres, gas failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The High Command had allocated no reserves to press home the breakthrough. After that first devastating attack, gas would never again have surprise on its side. The search for the key to the trench deadlock turned once again to tactics. From the near success of the British at Neuve-Chapelle, there were lessons to be learned. But the conclusions drawn by British and French generals were the wrong conclusions. Neuve-Chapelle had shown that a short, intense bombardment could deliver the most valuable asset of all, surprise. But instead, it was concluded that the key factor had been the sheer volume of shell fire. It was to be 1917 before the Western Allies reverted to a method that was so nearly successful. Unlike the British, the Germans had learned the lesson of Neuve-Chapelle. At Verdun, on February 21st, 1916, theory was put into practice. The German offensive would be based not on manpower, but on firepower. The attack would open with a short artillery bombardment of ferocious intensity and pinpoint accuracy. The aim was complete surprise. It was the greatest concentration of fire the war had yet seen. French trenches were annihilated along a front 15 miles wide. In the end, it was guns used against guns that saved the French at Verdun. One by one, French long-range artillery targeted the German 17-inch howitzers. One by one, the howitzers were destroyed. The remarkable precision of French gunnery was partly due to recent advances in their gun-laying technique. The characteristics of individual guns and weather conditions were now included in gun-laying data. For consistency, the ammunition for a battery was even drawn from the same production lot. The British too were making dramatic advances in gunnery technique. In particular, they were developing the art of counter-battery fire. Both the sound and the flash of attacking guns were used to calculate the distance of the battery. Within minutes of German gunners opening fire, they themselves became the target. By 1915, artillery was a more accurate and powerful weapon than ever before, but it had never been less mobile. The problem of artillery transport was becoming critical. Behind the front, the terrain was shattered for miles. Guns were heavier than ever, and the pulling power of horses was limited. Horses were vulnerable to gas and disease, but worst of all, they had to be fed. Maintaining supplies of fodder was becoming a logistical nightmare. For the British, forage had become the single largest item of supply sent to the front, larger even than ammunition. The answer was an American invention, the Holt Caterpillar tractor. The petrol-driven Holt tractor revolutionized the logistics of artillery transport. Not only could guns and ammunition be towed over devastated terrain, but those guns could be heavier than ever before. By June 1916, the Allies were desperate for a breakthrough. The sector chosen was the Somme. Never before had they encountered defensive earthworks on such a massive scale. The German lines had been transformed into a mighty fortress. From the beginning, the British had too few guns, spread out thinly along the line. Only the advantage of surprise could hope to compensate. But surprise was about to be thrown away. The preliminary bombardment began on June 24th. It lasted 8 days. Allied commanders predicted that after the bombardment, their infantry would simply walk over and take possession. But the Battle of the Somme proved no such walkover. The first wave of infantry advanced at a steady pace under cover of a creeping barrage of artillery. But the barrage moved forward far too quickly. The artillery fire plan was so rigidly centralized that it could not be altered. While battlefield intelligence and command decisions traveled through a long chain of intermediaries, the infantry was slaughtered in their thousands. Throughout 1917, both sides increasingly attempted to coordinate their artillery and infantry. But it was Germany that made the greatest progress. An artillery colonel, George Bruchmüller, had devised a new type of precision artillery preparation. The Bruchmüller method was a carefully orchestrated, short but intense bombardment. Different types of guns were allocated different targets. Area targets were avoided. Instead, guns concentrated on enemy artillery, observation posts, command centers, communications and reserve troop concentrations. For his offensive of March 1918, General Ludendorff used the Bruchmüller method with devastating effect. By now, both sides were supplementing their artillery with mortars. The earliest mortars appeared in 1915, but by 1918 they had been developed into a flexible and powerful weapon. Mortars fired a very heavy shell at a high angle over short distances. Because of their light weight, 1/9 of the weight of a howitzer of similar caliber, they were a cheap and mobile source of heavy firepower. More and more, these deadly weapons were placed in the hands of the infantry. With the development of the light mortar, the submachine gun, the hand grenade, and the flamethrower, the very nature of the infantryman was undergoing a revolution. The result was a new breed, the Stormtrooper. Ludendorff organized his Stormtroopers in tightly knit units. Instead of advancing in waves, they were a strike force, pushing through wherever they could force an opening. Pockets of resistance were simply bypassed. Although Stormtrooper offensives won for Germany a string of dramatic breakthroughs, their time had not yet come. Victory would be delivered not by men, but by machines. Britain, the oldest industrial power, had produced the ultimate war machine, the tank. It had only been a matter of time before Caterpillar-towed artillery became Caterpillar-mounted artillery. By combining protection, mobility, and firepower, the tank was going where artillery support had never gone, into the thick of the fighting. Years of trench deadlock had changed the very nature of guns, ammunition, and artillery tactics. Now, with the tank dominating the battlefields, the generals would again have to change radically their tactical doctrines. For Germany, it was already too late. At least it was too late for this war. The guns of the Great War had evolved in the deadlock of the trenches, and with the peace, the arguments began. In Britain, the static positional war of 1914–18 was seen as a special case, not likely to be met with again. In the minds of most generals, artillery was firmly associated with static war, and with the tank, the age of static war was over. The future of artillery as a major force was in serious doubt. In any case, attention was focused not on the ground, but on the skies. Everywhere, civilians and military alike were fascinated by the power of flight. The Great War had shown the overwhelming importance of material resources in an industrial war. The aeroplane would give nations the ability to strike directly at their enemies' industrial heartlands. The defense of production centers was seen as of the first priority. In Britain, especially, emphasis was on the anti-aircraft gun and the bomber. In the new Soviet Union, the perception was quite different. There, the danger posed by aircraft was limited by their restricted range. It was from the intervening armies of the Western powers that the danger was coming, and armies had to be met with artillery. The Soviets saw artillery as, above all, flexible, and with such vast frontiers, the Soviets needed flexibility of response more than anything else. The Red Army saw no contradiction between a war of maneuver and the full use of artillery. Marshal Tukhachevsky, inventor of the paratrooper, saw modern warfare as a war of maneuver fought with every mobile technology: aircraft, tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery. Amongst the Western powers, there was one country in which artillery was seen as the decisive weapon: France. But once again, her generals prepared for the wrong war. They expected a static conflict, one in which the positional tactics of the Great War would once more be the order of the day. Pre-planned bombardments were retained, and fire control was a slow and inflexible process. Even by 1936, it took French artillery some 8 minutes to fire on a position which had already been fixed, and a full 30 minutes to fire on one whose range and bearing had still to be calculated. The emphasis was on centralized control and firing from the map. Ironically, the French armed forces were well equipped for mobile war. By the late 1930s, France had a force of tanks greater than any other country in Europe. Their quality, too, was exceptional. But there was a fundamental flaw in the tactical thinking of French generals. They saw the tank as an infantry support weapon. However impressive the sight of massed French tanks on maneuvers, in actual battle they would never be deployed in such powerful concentrations. France's commitment to static defensive warfare was plain for all to see. It was written in concrete on the very landscape. While France planned for positional war fought from behind the Maginot Line, post-war Germany had not forgotten Ludendorff and his Stormtroopers. In the new regime of Adolf Hitler, revolutionary ideas found fertile ground. Hitler and his specialist in armored warfare, Heinz Guderian, were convinced that the defensive era of the machine gun was over. The new age was the age of mobility, the age of the tank. Even at sea, Germany applied the principles of mobile war. Heavy battleships were supplanted by smaller, faster pocket battleships. But the ultimate in the technology of infiltration and surprise attack was the U-boat. By 1936, with German rearmament in full swing, Hitler was presented with a golden opportunity to test German technology and German tactics: the Spanish Civil War. Hitler was confident that his aid to Franco's rebels would be tolerated by the Western powers. They would never intervene on the side of a socialist republic. While victory for Franco would mean a power friendly to Germany at the gates of the Mediterranean, it would also gain invaluable battlefield experience for the German armed forces. The Condor Legion learned its lessons quickly. Rigid First World War artillery tactics were abandoned. Firing from the map was too inflexible. Instead, the Germans made extensive use of observers based well forward. Radio communication replaced the field telephone. More and more, artillery became an integrated part of a fighting unit, attacking targets whenever they presented themselves. But the Soviet Union was learning too. Red Army advisors realized that to counter the threat of fascist tanks, there was no need for special artillery. Ordinary direct-fire field guns could do the job just as well. This realization was to have a profound impact on Soviet artillery doctrine, on the design of guns, and most important of all, on the training of Red Army gunners. The Soviets learned something else too. They learned that the indirect fire of massed artillery still had value on the battlefield. The Spanish experience would shape Soviet artillery tactics. In the future, all Soviet field artillery would have an anti-tank role, and the Red Army would retain a capability for massed indirect fire. On these doctrines would soon depend the very survival of the Soviet Union. As Germany and the Soviet Union learned their lessons in Spain, the United States was pursuing its own innovations. Since the Great War, the United States Army had been mostly equipped with the French quick-firing 75mm field gun. But in 1919, a board of inquiry concluded that light field guns had only limited usefulness. They recommended that the 75mm field gun be replaced by larger caliber gun howitzers. These would combine the direct fire capability of the gun with the arcing trajectory of the howitzer. By 1939, all the Western powers except France had followed the American lead. Between 1929 and 1941, US Army instructors at the US Field Artillery School, Fort Sill, concentrated on fire control. The aim was to escape the inflexible confines of centralized command while retaining a massed fire capability. Field telephones were replaced by radio, but most important of all, fire direction centers were created, capable of targeting scattered guns from different batteries or even battalions on a target pinpointed by a single observer. As the Americans maneuvered on the scale of a Hollywood epic, Europe was plunged into grim reality. Hitler's mechanized armies were on the move. The first that many in Poland knew of Blitzkrieg was the scream of the Stuka. In the German artillery preparation, long-range indirect fire guns had given way to the tactical bomber. Now the guns were in the very thick of the fighting. Their role was to act in direct support of armor and motorized infantry. In the panzer armies, the new unit system stressed the cooperation and flexibility of all arms, including artillery. It was perfectly adapted to the flux of fast-moving, mobile operations. To the Allied powers, the success of Blitzkrieg on Poland seemed to be an aberration, possible only because of the weakness of the Polish armed forces. When, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, few realized that Blitzkrieg was war of a new and entirely different kind. As France waited, apparently secure behind her Maginot Line, the war in the West settled down to the familiar Great War pattern, fixed emplacements and sporadic artillery duels. Then came the shock. On May 10, 1940, the Panzers, bypassing the Maginot Line, struck through the Ardennes forest. France was totally unprepared for a war fought with concentrated, fast-moving armor. French heavy artillery was obsolete and lacked mobility. Their failure to use forward observation and radio links meant that too often the guns were responding to a situation already long changed. Worst of all, the French were deficient in anti-tank guns, between 30 and 50% below establishment. They were forced to rely on pre-World War I 75mm field guns. Unlike Red Army gunners, few French artillerymen were either trained to fight tanks or equipped with the armor-piercing ammunition they so desperately needed. France's own tank forces were, in theory, well capable of blunting the armored thrust of the panzers. But neither French nor British tanks were deployed in powerful concentrations. In little over a month, Paris had fallen and the British had evacuated at Dunkirk. In less than a year, Hitler had won domination over the entire continent of Europe. It had taken Napoleon 10 years to achieve less. With the defeat of France, Hitler waited. His intention was to gain a peace agreement with Great Britain that would allow him to concentrate on his real objective, the Soviet Union. But there would be no agreement. Hitler was left with little option but to plan for invasion. On July 21st, 1940, he called a meeting of Army, Air Force and Naval chiefs. They were to prepare for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. Hitler himself took little interest in Operation Sea Lion. Planning was left to his service chiefs, and there was little in the way of a coordinated strategy. But it was agreed that before any invasion, the British would first have to be defeated in the air. The key would be the bomber. Pre-war, Britain's commitment to air defence had only just survived the years of pre-war austerity. To meet the threat of the Luftwaffe, Britain in 1940 had under 2,000 anti-aircraft guns, less than a quarter of the number needed for an adequate air defence. But the guns themselves had improved dramatically. To cope with the aeroplane's greater speed and altitude, the range and rate of fire of anti-aircraft guns had been greatly increased. The 3.7-inch medium anti-aircraft gun fired a 28-pound mechanically time-fused shell 32,000 feet. It could fire 25 rounds per minute. For defence against fast, low-flying aircraft, the British had acquired the Bofors gun from Sweden. Developed in the early 1930s, the Bofors 40mm had a range of over 4 miles. Because its ammunition was loaded in 4-round clips and fed automatically, it was capable of firing 120 rounds per minute. But, as with ground artillery, the guns were only as good as the direction-finding systems used to aim them. In the 1930s, infrared detection had been tried and had failed. In 1940, radar was still in its infancy, and its application restricted to the control of fighter cover. The warning system used by British anti-aircraft crews was based on huge parabolic mirrors, acting as sound detectors. They were easily evaded. On September 10, 1940, the sound detection system was abandoned. Anti-aircraft gunners were instructed to fire every available round, if necessary, using pure guesswork. The effect was more on the morale of Londoners than on the German raiders. On the night of the 15th of October, 8,326 shells were fired at 235 German aircraft over London. 2 were destroyed and 2 damaged. It would be spring 1941 before radar sets would be produced in sufficient quantities or be sufficiently mobile for anti-aircraft gun laying. In 1940, it was not anti-aircraft artillery that saved Britain. It was the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and the men who flew them. Goering had neglected the power of the fighter plane. Although the Luftwaffe had many more bombers than the British RAF, it had only equal numbers of fighters, and they would be operating at the very limit of their range. Goering, instead of concentrating on the destruction of British fighter cover, persisted in bombing urban and industrial targets. Luftwaffe bomber crews would pay a heavy price. By September 17, 1940, the Battle of Britain was over. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Throughout the Luftwaffe campaign against Britain, Hitler's eyes had remained fixed on the Soviet Union. But once again, events would distract him from the great prize. In September 1940, Mussolini had invaded Egypt. Already, as the Battle of Britain raged, Churchill had dispatched 2/3 of his entire tank strength to Egypt. They would win Britain's greatest tactical successes of the war. By February 1940, General O'Connor, with never more than 2 divisions, had destroyed 10 Italian divisions and taken 130,000 prisoners. O'Connor had lost only 438 men. Mussolini, in imminent danger of being driven from North Africa, appealed to the Führer. Hitler's answer was Erwin Rommel. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941. Facing Rommel's panzers were British forces armed with 2-pounder anti-tank guns. Although an excellent anti-tank weapon in the pre-war years, the 2-pounder had a range of only 400 to 500 yards. Against Mark III panzers with a range of 600 yards, they were at a fatal disadvantage. Not only were the British suffering from obsolete equipment, their tactics were flawed too. The anti-tank gun was seen by the British as a defensive weapon. German tactical doctrine emphasized its role in the attack. Even on sustained offensives, German artillery would at all costs keep pace with the panzers. While German tanks never fought unsupported, British armour would charge forward, outstripping their infantry and artillery support. A favourite tactic of Rommel's was to send a group of panzers to lure British tanks into a hidden net of anti-tank guns. Without their own artillery support and armed with 2-pounder guns incapable of firing high explosive shells, they were at the mercy of the German anti-tank guns. The standard anti-tank gun of the Afrika Korps was the Pak-38. With a range of 3,000 yards and a rate of fire of 16 rounds per minute, it was a formidable weapon. It would be 1942 before the British would finally replace their obsolete 2-pounders. The war in North Africa was as much a war of artillery as of tanks. Once more, the German unit system, based on the cooperation of all arms, was proving its worth. With the British threat in North Africa broken by a force of greatly inferior strength, Hitler's way was clear. It was time to realize his most cherished ambition. June 22nd, 1941, the German-Soviet frontier. 3 million soldiers in 146 divisions, 3,196 tanks, 3,000 aircraft, and 7,184 guns prepared for Operation Barbarossa. The objectives: seizure of the Donetsk Basin and the capture of Moscow. At 3:15 a.m., every German gun on the front opened up on Soviet positions. Amongst this massive array of artillery, the gun that would become the most feared of German heavy mobile artillery, the 170mm K-18. It would outrange all comparable Allied guns until the advent of the American 8-inch in 1942. For counter-battery fire, the Germans had 150mm guns and howitzers. As the panzers swept over Soviet frontiers in 3 great surges, their supporting artillery was already with them. The training of unit commanders had emphasized that close support artillery fire was to be used in all engagements, and throughout, the emphasis was on forward observation. Artillery observers, riding in armored cars, specially equipped tanks, or Faisaler Storch observation planes, were in direct contact with artillery commanders. In Spain, much had been learned. Facing the panzers were Soviet forces of nearly 4.5 million men, 25,000 tanks, 6,000 aircraft, and tens of thousands of guns. But the Red Army was unprepared for the onslaught. The valuable experience gained in Spain had been lost in Stalin's purges. Throughout the Red Army, initiative had been stifled. By early July, the German Army Group Center alone had taken 287,700 prisoners and destroyed over 2,500 tanks. In spite of the panzer's dramatic tactical successes, all was not going to plan. In France and in Poland, Blitzkrieg had shattered the will of defenders. But all over the Eastern Front, Red Army units, hopelessly cut off, stubbornly refused to surrender. While mopping up operations were costing the Germans precious time, large Red Army formations were pulling back and regrouping. They launched a series of furious counteroffensives. It was fast becoming clear to the German High Command that there was more to the Red Army than they had chosen to acknowledge. Intelligence reports had wildly underestimated the number of available Soviet divisions. They had anticipated 200 and had already encountered 360. But an even more deadly surprise was to come. German gunners were encountering a new and terrifying tank, the T-34. Against a T-34, the Pak-38 anti-tank gun was almost useless. Armor-piercing shot simply bounced off its sloped armor. The only hope for a unit which encountered a T-34 was to call up the most powerful anti-tank gun in the German arsenal, the 88. The 88 originated in 1925 as the 88mm Flak 18, a heavy anti-aircraft gun, firing a 20-pound shell. It had a muzzle velocity of 2,755 feet per second and could fire 15 rounds per minute. Fired horizontally, the 88 had a range of 16,600 yards. During the war in Spain, the Condor Legion had, out of necessity, used the 88 as an anti-tank gun. It proved a formidable weapon. The high muzzle velocity required of an anti-aircraft gun was perfectly suited to an anti-tank role, so well suited that by 1940 all German anti-aircraft guns were fitted with telescopic sights, and all flak units were trained to engage tanks. But already the demands on the 88s and on German armour were stretched to the limit. When General Guderian asked Hitler for more tanks, he was told, "If I had known that the figures for the Russian tanks which you gave were the true ones, I would not, I believe, have started this war." Germany was now faced with a major decision. Should the main weight of the attack be placed on the wings or on the centre, towards Moscow? For a month, as the General Staff argued, the armies waited. On the 23rd of August, the offensive was resumed. Hitler had taken personal command of the offensive. Guderian's drive on Moscow was abandoned. Army Group North struck for Leningrad, and Army Group South for the industrial treasures of the Donetsk Basin. For a time, it seemed that fortune was on Germany's side. By late September, Leningrad had been encircled and Kiev had fallen. Soviet losses in the south alone were over 1,500 tanks, 6,500 guns, and more than 1 million men taken prisoner, doomed to prison camps and starvation. Hitler declared to the German people, "The enemy is broken and will never be in a position to rise again." The offensive against Moscow was on, but by now it was October. Operation Barbarossa had been intended to achieve the conquest of the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. Speed was of the essence. But German intelligence had failed yet again. They had presumed on the existence of a network of good roads. All the Wehrmacht found were tracks. The support vehicles on which the panzers relied for their fuel and ammunition were wheeled vehicles. In the age of mechanized war, many German guns were still drawn by teams of horses. As the rains came, chaos came with it. Increasingly, the tanks outstripped their supplies and their close support artillery. As the weeks wore on, rain turned to snow. The German guns had never been designed to operate in such conditions. Firing mechanisms jammed for the lack of low-temperature oil, while gun carriages froze to the ground. The very steel turned brittle from the cold. As the Wehrmacht battled in conditions for which it was totally unprepared, the Red Army was preparing for its life-or-death struggle. Already there had been profound changes. Personal command of the defense of Moscow had been handed over to a man who, a year earlier, German intelligence had never even heard of. General Georgy Zhukov would become the Soviet Union's most successful general. He had already given ample proof of his abilities. His armored divisions had inflicted a heavy defeat on the Japanese in Mongolia. He had already successfully defended Leningrad against the German Army Group North. Now he was to save Moscow itself. With the threat from Japan receding, Stalin recalled from the Far East 25 of the Red Army's best-equipped divisions. To the exhausted Wehrmacht, they would come as a deep shock. On November 12th, the German generals again reconsidered their position. Many were in favor of postponing the offensive until the spring, but Hitler's orders had to be obeyed. After a series of indecisive battles, the Germans suffered their first defeat at the hands of the Red Army. In the face of a fierce assault from Zhukov's T-34s, the city of Rostov was again in Soviet hands. The battle ebbed and flowed. By the 2nd of December, units of the Wehrmacht had penetrated the suburbs of Moscow. The situation for Zhukov was desperate. As T-34 tanks left the production lines, they were flung straight into the thick of battle. Slowly and painfully, the German High Command came to accept that they had little hope of immediate success. Moscow would not be taken that winter. German intelligence assessed the situation. They were confident that the Soviets were too weak to carry out a large-scale offensive. On 5th December, Zhukov struck. It was a general counter-offensive along the entire Moscow front. There was a new force in Soviet artillery, the Katyusha. Between 1934 and 1938, the gas dynamic laboratory in Leningrad had developed 82mm and 132mm rockets for ground and aerial use. On the very eve of Operation Barbarossa, Stalin had given the go-ahead for full-scale production. To the beleaguered Soviet Union, they were a blessing. Artillery ammunition rejected as substandard could make an effective Katyusha warhead. Mounted on multiple launchers, the Katyusha would become one of the most feared weapons on the Eastern Front. Their eerie scream was the terror of German infantrymen. By January, the Red Army had reached Smolensk. It would be the following May before Hitler would again regain the initiative in the East. As the Soviet Union fought for its survival, Germany was everywhere fighting on foreign soil. The fatherland seemed unassailable. In 1942, there was little prospect of the Allies invading the European mainland. The waters of the English Channel and the guns of German coastal defenses would see to that. But the British and American Air Force chiefs were convinced that Germany could be all but defeated without a long and costly invasion. The pre-war conviction that wars would be won from the air had taken deep root. For 1942, Sir Arthur Harris, later head of the British Bomber Command, had planned a massive air offensive on Germany. As the Germans had used the Stuka as a form of tactical artillery, the Allies would use the long-range heavy bomber as strategic artillery. In spite of the confidence of the Air Force chiefs and the enthusiasm of the British and American public, the heads of other services had grave misgivings. In the event, their doubts would prove fully justified. In 1942, the Allies had neither the aircraft nor the skills to conduct precision bombing. The alternative was the indiscriminate mass air raid. The effect on German war production was minimal. The cost in civilian casualties in the hundreds of thousands. But as the Luftwaffe bombing campaign on Britain in 1940 had only stiffened civilian morale, the British campaign achieved precisely the same, and at tremendous cost to the British. Without long-range fighters as escorts, losses to German air defences were heavy. The replacement of bombers was enormously expensive. In 1942, more than a third of all British war production was devoted to bomber production. The bombing offensive against Germany was defended so stoutly by the Royal Air Force that, at a time when Britain was losing a greater tonnage of ships to the U-boats than it could build, they refused to attack U-boat bases in France. When they did finally agree, they dropped 20,000 tons of bombs without destroying a single submarine. By the summer of 1942, the British sorely needed a victory. In North Africa, Rommel had inflicted a heavy defeat at Gazala, forcing the British to retreat to a defensive line at El Alamein. In Alexandria, there was panic. Files at the British embassy were burnt, and the ambassador prepared to leave. Confidence in the British command had all but evaporated. But the tide was about to turn. Rommel's forces were too weak to break through prepared defenses. With his supply lines now stretched almost 1,000 miles, Rommel was desperately short of fuel and ammunition, and the British supply position was improving daily. New 6-pounder anti-tank guns were a match even for the heavily armoured Mark IV Panzers. But no guns, however fine, could themselves restore British morale. Only a new leader could do that. On August 13th, he arrived. Montgomery brought to Cairo determined leadership and a complete change in British tactics. He was determined to exploit to the full British material superiority. As in the First World War, it would be a slogging match, The key would be defense in depth and the deployment of massed artillery. With the fall of Tobruk, the United States had immediately dispatched 300 tanks and 100 105mm self-propelled guns. More were arriving daily, but the backbone of Montgomery's field artillery would be the British 25-pounder. Early in the North African campaign, the 25-pounder gun howitzer had replaced the 18-pounder field gun and the 4.5-inch howitzer as the standard field artillery piece. It was designed primarily as an indirect fire weapon, but was used extensively as a direct fire anti-tank gun. It took only 1 minute to emplace the 25-pounder, and its ingenious circular platform allowed the gun to be traversed through a full 360 degrees, a vital asset in anti-tank fighting. There were purpose-built anti-tank guns too. New 17-pounder anti-tank guns had arrived in Egypt in large numbers, but even such formidable firepower was considered by Montgomery to be insufficient. He ordered his artillery defences to be strengthened by deploying tanks buried in hull-down positions. On August 31st, Rommel launched his offensive. His force of 200 German and 243 Italian tanks drove straight into a death trap. By September 3rd, Rommel's surviving tanks had been withdrawn, but Montgomery refused to follow up with an immediate counterblow. His objective was overwhelming material superiority. By October 23rd, Montgomery was ready. The Battle of El Alamein opened with 824 25-pounder and 48 medium guns bombarding German artillery. Then, after 20 minutes, they switched to hammer the Axis forward positions. The British fired over 1 million rounds before the infantry charged. The effect on German and Italian morale was devastating. Montgomery's strategy was to fight a battle of attrition. He would crumble Rommel's defences by the sheer weight of 230,000 men and nearly 1,500 tanks. But the 80,000 Axis troops and 540 tanks would extract a bloody price. On November 2nd, the 9th Armoured Brigade, with 123 Shermans and Crusader tanks, were ordered to destroy the last line of German anti-tank defences, if necessary, taking 100% casualties. All but 19 of its tanks were lost to a screen of 88s. But Montgomery could afford the losses. Rommel could not. After 12 days of battle, British command of the air and overwhelming artillery firepower had reduced the Africa Corps to only 35 tanks. The following months were a catalogue of German disasters. But in the east, the scale of defeat was unimaginably greater than anything seen in North Africa. Within weeks of Rommel's defeat at El Alamein, the entire Sixth Army of Field Marshal von Paulus was surrounded at Stalingrad. On February 2nd, 1943, the starving remnants of a force of 600,000 men surrendered to the Red Army. Stalingrad was a disaster, but the Wehrmacht was by no means a spent force. Germany still held the line from which they'd launched their 1942 offensive. Soon, Hitler would make one more attempt to regain the strategic initiative at the Kursk salient. At Kursk, the Soviet defensive zone was, in places, 100 miles deep. It was to be assaulted by the most powerful armoured spearheads Germany had ever assembled, half its entire tank strength on the Eastern Front. The attack began on July 4th. It would plunge headlong into the most sophisticated system of anti-tank defences in the history of warfare. Zhukov's reorganization had changed the face of the Red Army. Tank forces had been restructured into tank armies. Anti-tank regiments had been combined into brigades. And there was another far-reaching innovation. Artillery breakthrough divisions had been created. These formations were so successful that in the following December, the German Field Marshal von Manstein would himself form an artillery division. The Soviet Union had another unique structure that was to have far-reaching implications. the artillery reserve of the High Command. Since its formation in 1941, this increasingly powerful force formed artillery fists used in all offensives. At Kursk, the density of Soviet artillery reached 148 guns per kilometer of front. There were changes in the deployment of rockets too. Katyusha batteries, instead of being dispersed, were concentrated into 4 divisions, each one capable of delivering a salvo of 3,840 rockets in one devastating punch. The panzers had driven straight into a cauldron of fire. The battle raged for a month without pause. Soviet anti-tank guns alone destroyed 40% of the attacking panzers. Of the 2,700 German tanks thrown into the Kursk salient, 90% were destroyed. The Wehrmacht lost 2,500 tanks, 1,200 aircraft, and 800 guns. It was the ultimate triumph of artillery over armor. The panzer armies in the east would never recover. In spite of the Soviet advances in the Ukraine and the Allied invasion of Italy, Germany, by 1944, was still a power to be reckoned with. Defeat on foreign battlefields was one thing, the destruction of the fatherland quite another. The Allied invasion of France, planned for June 1944, would be met with formidable obstacles and the fiercest resistance. Ever since the conquest of France, Germany had been fortifying the French coastline. In January 1944, Rommel had been switched to the Western Front. Immediately, using 500,000 slave laborers, he heavily reinforced the Atlantic Wall. By the eve of D-Day, it was a forest of pillboxes, gun emplacements, barbed wire, and underwater obstacles. Behind these bristling defenses were at least 40 available divisions, 12 of them armored. June the 6th, 1944, Operation Overlord. As the ships of the Allied invasion fleet waited for dawn, RAF heavy bombers pounded the coastal guns of the Atlantic Wall with 5,200 tons of high explosives. At daybreak, it was the turn of the Americans. As the aircraft left off, the guns of 200 Allied warships began their bombardment. With a range of up to 16 miles, naval guns would provide some of the most precise and effective artillery bombardments of Operation Overlord. Although the German High Command fully expected an invasion, they disagreed amongst themselves as to where it would take place. In any case, the stormy weather had led many to believe an invasion impossible. 3 of the German senior commanders, including Rommel, were away from their headquarters. As the Allied landing craft approached the beaches, they revealed startling innovations. Instead of being vulnerable, unarmed barges, many were equipped with their own artillery. The infantry would have immediate close support fire from guns, mortars, and multiple rocket launchers. The bombardment from naval guns, landing craft, and amphibious tanks was so great that in many places Allied troops were ashore before the German gunners could recover. The coastal guns and machine guns had been designed to cope with an invasion at high tide, with the enemy at long range. But the Allies had landed at half tide. The guns, in their thick concrete shelters, had only the narrowest angle of fire. By evening, 156,000 Allied troops were on French soil. In the following month, the problem for the Allies was to break out of the pocket they had created. A pocket ringed by German artillery and tanks. It was perfect defensive terrain. For the British in particular, it was a battle of attrition. The superior quality of German tanks was making itself painfully felt. It was taking 5 Shermans to destroy 1 German Tiger. But the Allies had a new force in tank fighting, the rocket-firing fighter plane. For 12 days, the Allies continued to pour men and equipment into Normandy. With railways wrecked and Allied fighter bombers making roads impassable in daylight, the Germans were unable to strike with battle-ready formations. 2 SS Panzer divisions, switched from the Eastern Front, took longer to cover the last 400 miles to Normandy than the previous 1,400 miles. But if the panzers could not attack in force, they could dig in and defend. The narrow lanes and crisscrossing ditches of the bocage concealed screens of 88s, tanks, and mobile artillery. On July 25th, General Patton's Third Army prepared for the breakout. Operation Cobra began with a massive artillery bombardment on an area of the German lines only 5 miles long and 1 mile wide. Then came the bombers, 3,000 of them, dropping 4,000 tons of high explosive, shrapnel, and napalm. The German commander, General Alamein, described the aftermath as like a moonscape. 70% of the German defenders were killed, wounded, or driven insane. By August 1st, the Third Army was in open country. For Hitler, the Battle of Normandy was lost. The invasion of France had been achieved by overwhelming material superiority, command of the air, and an arsenal of technological innovations, from walkie-talkie radios to rocket-firing aircraft. But the Germans themselves had, throughout the invasion, their own formidable secret weapon. If it had been used against the Allies densely packed on the beachheads, its consequences might have been profound. But it was not. Instead, it was used against the City of London. The new weapon was a long-range, unmanned jet, the 400 miles per hour V1. Between June and mid-July 1944, 4,000 V1s were fired at England. Of these, only 261 were destroyed by anti-aircraft guns. The reason was simple. Flying at 3,500 feet, the V1 flew too high for light guns and too low and too fast for most heavy guns. Only the power-operated 3.7-inch gun could be traversed quickly and smoothly enough to have much hope of success. But they demanded special concrete emplacements. In a massive operation, British anti-aircraft defences were mobilised to meet the new threat, and a tactic was adopted which was to have a remarkable degree of success. Instead of ringing the major cities with guns, the entire defensive effort was moved to the coast. Over 400 heavy and 1,000 light guns were manned by British and American crews along a defensive line known as the Diver Belt. Because the defences faced out to sea, fighter cover could be held back as a last resort defence, minimising confusion. It also meant that the British could use their own ground-to-air rockets. These, in mass batteries of 64 twin projectors, were fired in salvos, producing a screen of shrapnel. The strength of the Diver Belt would eventually reach a total of 800 heavy, 1,800 light guns, and 700 anti-aircraft rockets. By the end of August, the percentage of V1 kills had reached 74%. For the final defeat of the flying bomb offensive, 2 more technical advances were invaluable. The first was an American development, the SCR-584 radar. This did not just detect incoming rockets, but automatically locked a power-controlled gun onto the target. The result was the first completely automated targeting system. The second development was the VT proximity fuse. Originating in Britain and developed in America, the VT proximity fuse emitted its own radar signal and detected its reflection from the target. As soon as it came within range, it detonated. These developments came just in time for the City of London. By September 1944, V1 rockets were being air-launched from a fleet of 90 Heinkel bombers. Between September 1944 and January 1945, 1,200 rockets were launched. Of those which reached the English coast, the guns alone destroyed over 50%. But there was a new rocket threat, the V2. The V2 launching system was small, simple to erect, and very mobile. British bombers struck time after time at launch sites in Holland, but without success. The rockets themselves, with their 1-ton warhead, were a vast improvement on their predecessors. As the V2 descended, it travelled at supersonic speed, far faster than could be tracked, and faster than a gun could be traversed. The British response was the establishment of a mobile radar unit in the Netherlands itself. Very early warning, the detection of a rocket on launching, was the only hope. But even that failed. 517 V2s hit London, and rocket attacks ceased only when the German missile regiment withdrew in the face of the Allied advance. December 1944. In a last-ditch offensive aimed at the capture of Antwerp, German tanks, following the successful formula of 1940, struck through the Ardennes. With Allied aircraft grounded by bad weather, the 6th SS and 5th Panzer armies took the Americans completely by surprise. But Allied recovery was swift. American airborne troops held the vital town of Bastogne against determined armored assault, while Patton's tanks raced through the Ardennes. But it was American artillery strikes which delivered the greatest surprise of the battle. As an intense artillery bombardment caught German columns in the open, consternation broke out amongst the infantry. The American gunners were using the new VT proximity fuse, with high explosive and shrapnel shells. Each fuse was carefully set to detonate above the ground, at the height at which its effects would be most destructive. They were 10 times more lethal than shells with conventional fuses. Under the onslaught, the Ardennes offensive stalled. Hitler's last gamble had failed. Now, everywhere, Germany was on the defensive. As the Western Allies approached the frontiers of the fatherland, in the east, the advance of the Red Army was gathering momentum. By now, the Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun had been superseded by the 57mm M1943. It was, for its firepower, an extraordinarily light weapon. Like all Soviet guns, it was also simple and cheap to manufacture. Originally, the M1943 was supplied with simple armor-piercing shells, but these were soon supplemented by tungsten-cored arrowhead shot with excellent penetration. By 1945, a new Soviet anti-tank gun was reaching the battlefields, the 100mm M1944. It was one of the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war. Berlin, 1945. 320 square miles of urban landscape, thick with heavily fortified strongpoints, underground bunkers, and anti-tank barriers. But on the threshold of the city itself lay an even more formidable obstacle, the Silov Heights. Lying in front of Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front, the Silov Heights were in places 200 feet high, festooned with German fortifications and gun sites. The key to the attack was to be a massive artillery preparation. For the assault on Berlin, 7 million shells had been brought to the front, carried on newly laid broad-gauge railroads. They were to feed over 16,000 Soviet guns. On the first Belarusian front alone, Soviet aircraft flew 2,500 photographic missions, plotting German defenses to a depth of 60 miles. Soviet artillery density on the breakthrough sectors was 295 guns and mortars per kilometer of front. All of them were over 75mm caliber, and there were huge numbers of 152 and 203mm howitzers, 160mm mortars, and Katyushas. At 5 a.m. on April 16, 1945, Zhukov unleashed his artillery. 500,000 shells rained down on German 6th Army positions in only 20 minutes. As 143 searchlights blazed across the lines, a double-rolling barrage was followed by infantry only 150 yards behind. But the Oder Valley was a maze of streams and canals. Already, tanks and self-propelled guns were floundering, while below the heights, the only bridges were under German artillery fire. As the infantry fought their way through the swamps, the armor was forced to look for other ways to ascend the heights. In doing so, they ran straight into German strongpoints. To meet the new situation, Soviet artillery was forced to redeploy. At noon, Zhukov could wait no longer. He threw in both of his tank armies. 1,377 tanks and self-propelled guns raced in a frantic dash for the heights. Restricted to the roads by the boggy terrain, the Soviet tanks were easy targets for 88 and 155mm guns at point-blank range. That day, the Soviets gained only 5 to 7 miles. There had been no breakthrough. The following day, the 17th, Zhukov once more unleashed his artillery. At 1000 hours, massed guns, mortars and rockets delivered a 40-minute barrage, while hundreds of aircraft bombed German positions. Even before the barrage had lifted, the first tanks and infantry had already begun the assault. This time, they succeeded. By noon, Zhukov's armor had reached the village of Silov itself. Through it ran a motorway, straight to the heart of Berlin. Phase 1 of the assault on the outer defences of Berlin lasted from the 16th to the 19th of April. Phase 2, launched on the 20th, was an assault on the city itself. In urban warfare, Soviet artillery tactics showed terrifying ingenuity. An enemy-occupied building would be first shrouded in smoke by a team of 2 light field guns. Then, behind the screen, a 203mm howitzer, manhandled into position, would blast the building to its foundations. But the Germans had street-fighting tactics of their own, and a weapon that, even in the hands of boys, spelt the end for hundreds of Soviet tank crews. The weapon was the Panzerfaust. Covering tanks with mattresses from wrecked houses was the only defense available. On the 25th of April alone, more than 42,000 Soviet artillery pieces fired over 2 million shells. Some buildings were hit over 1,000 times. So terrifying was such a storm that of the 130 survivors taken from the cellars of the Air Ministry, 17 had gone mad. It was Stalin who singled out artillery as the arm which had, above all others, achieved dominance on the eastern battlefields and shattered the might of the panzers. But in both world wars, on all the major fronts, artillery was the single greatest killer. It accounted for between 50 and 70% of all casualties. It was with good reason that Stalin called artillery the god of war.